Recording has been started.
Good morning, our viewers in United States, and good evening to our distinguished speaker, as well as viewers who are currently in India. My name is Dr. Adit Adityanjee, and I'm the President of Council for Strategic Affairs. We are here for our monthly distinguished lecture series. Those of you who registered probably registered through this flyer. And the topic of today's distinguished lecture is India-ASEAN partnership, what is the future? Our distinguished speaker for today is Ambassador Professor Veena Sikri. Today is August 27, 2022, 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime in US and 7:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time in New Delhi. A little bit about Council for Strategic Affairs. Council imparts education in the field of international relations. CSA fosters discussion, dialogue, and debate on geopolitical issues. CSA encourages strategic studies in general to raise the level of awareness. CSA condemns terrorism in all its forms worldwide, no exceptions. And CSA aims to contribute towards world peace and prosperity. So we have several activities. We have a monthly roundtable discussion on second Saturday of each month at 10 a.m. Eastern Daytime. And as a standard, on fourth Saturday of each month, we have a distinguished lecture by a domain expert. We also organize symposia, meetings, and conferences. We promote publications of articles on geopolitics and related subjects. And we have a summer internship program for college students. So the distinguished speaker for today is Ambassador Veena Sikri. She is founding trustee and convener of South Asia Women's Network, of what is called SWAN. And we were just talking about it. And I'll interpret this by saying that she's a proponent of harnessing Nari Shakti.
Yes.
She is vice chairperson of South Asia Foundation, SAF India in New Delhi. Her career and experience straddle the worlds of academia and diplomacy, and actually that extends to her home because she's also married to an IFS officer. She has served 37 years as a career diplomat with the Indian Foreign Service, including as High Commissioner to Bangladesh from 2003 to 2006, and as High Commissioner to Malaysia from 2000 to 2003, as Consul General in Hong Kong from 1996 to 2000, and Director General of the Indian Council for Cultural Relations in New Delhi from 1989 to 1992. She has held challenging and prestigious assignments at the Indian embassies in Moscow, Kathmandu, Paris, and at the Permanent Mission of India to the United Nations in New York, where she represented in India in the UN Security Council, in the ECOSOC, and at the summit meetings of the Non-Aligned Movement, or so-called NAM. After retiring from the Indian Foreign Service, Ambassador Veena Sikri joined academia as professor holding the Ford Foundation Endowed Chair at Academy of International Studies at the Jamia Millia Islamia University in New Delhi from February 2009 to October 2013. She was concurrently visiting senior research fellow with the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore from November 2008 to October 2011, and her work at ISEAS resulted in a book on Malaysia-India relationship. So I will move on to the actual topic. This shows you the map of the ASEAN countries. ASEAN stands for Association of Southeast Asian Nations. It's a grouping of 10 nations in Indo-Pacific, and there are the maps as well as the flags of these countries. Why India and ASEAN relationship is important? If you look at this map, it shows you the Nicobar Islands, the part of Andaman and Nicobar Islands. They are only 90 nautical miles away from western tip of Indonesia. So in a sense, part of India is in the Southeast Asian region. And that's why it is important for India to have partnership with ASEAN. Ambassador Sikri will be discussing the historical issues, current issues, as well as what is the future of this partnership. We have to say that despite progress made over the last 25 years in India-ASEAN ties, there remains an immense scope for future growth in the relationship. Indo-Pacific is one of the most dynamic regions of the world today, and it is necessary for both India and ASEAN countries to keep contributing to the shaping of the so-called Asian country. And all of us know that United States has spearheaded something called Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. And I can say at this point in time, last year I had suggested creating a new organization called IPCO, Indo-Pacific Cooperation Organization. And if you read my article on IPCO, you will find that Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is pretty much the same with a different name. There are formidable security challenges in Indo-Pacific. And these security challenges are there for India as well as ASEAN countries. Therefore, both the parties, the two sides, must think strategically to increase the cooperation for a favorable balance of power, as maintaining the regional peace and stability is a priority for both India as well as ASEAN countries. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our distinguished speaker, Ambassador and Professor Veena Sikri, who is speaking to us from New Delhi in India for her distinguished oration. Professor Sikri, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank the Council for Strategic Affairs and Dr. Adit Adityanjee personally for inviting me to deliver this distinguished lecture and for suggesting the subject as well. It's a very interesting subject. I'd like to also thank the members of the distinguished audience who are here and Mr. Pachori, who is also the host for this afternoon's meeting. Yes, I think that this subject of India-ASEAN partnership, what is the future, is really topical and important. The Indo-Pacific, as you in your excellent synopsis, you have said, the Indo-Pacific is indeed the flavor of the decade. And ASEAN is now, the centrality of ASEAN to this region is the paramount factor at work. But as we look at this evolving relationship and see what we can do with it, it is valuable to cast our view, our attention back to the origins of the India-ASEAN relationship, because this gives us a very good guide as to where it came from, and also because even today, India and ASEAN, we both value the heritage, the civilizational heritage in our relationship. And that's a very great binding force in developing this relationship. So I'd like to go back a little. And the other reason that I'd like to go back is that you mentioned my book on India and Malaysia. So when I was working on this book, I wanted to bring out a fact that struck me when I was High Commissioner in Malaysia, which is that everybody there, it was the common knowledge, and everybody said that India-Malaysia relationship began only after the British arrived on the scene. So it was something the colonial powers developed, the relationship between India and Malaysia. It struck me as I knew it was completely incorrect and wrong. So when I was writing the book, I was determined to bring out the importance of the pre-colonial interaction between India and Malaysia. So the pre-colonial interaction brings out one important fact, which is the wealth of India in the pre-colonial period. And this wealth of India is what attracted the colonial powers to come to India, because they wanted to participate in this wealth. They wanted to draw out the wealth as much as possible. They wanted to get their share of it. They wanted a finger in the pie. So the important thing is to see how this wealth developed. Even in the early years of this millennium, of the first millennium CE, we have work done by Dr. Angus Maddison. He's a historian, an economic historian, and he has done very interesting work. He's written a book on the contours of the world economy from 1 AD to 2030 AD. Now, in this, he brings out that in the very first year of this millennium, India had 33% share of the world GDP. And China at that time had about 22% share of the world GDP. So in fact, the first millennium was the Asian millennium. We talk now about an Asian century, but it was the first millennium, the first 1,000 years, which were the Asian millennium. How did this happen? What was the wealth? How was it developed? And I think there are two factors to bear in mind when we consider the development of this wealth. The first is that it developed largely through the maritime domain. It was a wealth which developed through trade. And India at that time was at the center of the trade relationship between East Asia on the one hand and West Europe on the other. So the map that you showed in the beginning was a very good map, actually, because it shows, you showed the eastern part of the map, beginning with India and then the eastern area, the whole of ASEAN, and of course, China and Japan definitely were there. But if you look at the western part, you see the western part up to Europe, then India becomes squarely in the middle. India at that time had a very active navy. In fact, the kings of southern India, of Tamil Nadu and Andhra, they had powerful navies of their own. The merchant navy fleet was among the strongest in the world. At that time, in fact, China had no navy at all. They only had coastal shipping. So the whole purpose of the development of the utilization of India's naval fleet, the merchant navy and the thing, was to take the ships right up to the to Cambodia and Vietnam, that region. That was where the first Hindu-Buddhist kingdoms were developed, and where coastal shipping brought the Chinese goods for trade, for taking back to India and West Europe, and of course for the Chinese merchants to purchase Indian goods and spices and so on. So that is how Southeast Asia became a very important partner in the development of the wealth of South Asia and of Asia as a whole. It is important to know that even at that time, Southeast Asia, the ASEAN countries, so we're excluding China and Japan from this, but Southeast Asia had almost 4% of the world's GDP. So they were an active player. And they had this tremendously positive cultural, trade, religion-based relationship with India. So the vessels went there, they picked up the goods, they came back, and for the trade with the west of India, we had Arab vessels also, and we had Indian vessels also. European shipping had not developed very much at that time. So West Asia at that time had about 10% of world GDP because they were playing such a big part in this trade. So the maritime domain was the key. The maritime domain is what brought the spread of this wealth, and India at that time had a very strong role in the shipping and in the trade and in the naval. Now, what happened in the middle of the second millennium, around 1500 AD, we had the colonial powers arriving. 1498, Vasco da Gama arrived in Kerala, and then we had after that the British. Now, the British actually at that time, what was the main area of the main factors of trade? Spices. Spices were in huge demand, and you cannot imagine that perhaps millions of tons of spices were traded every year between India, Southeast Asia, and Europe. Now, India had a huge production, but it was not enough for the insatiable demand of the West. So the trade went into Southeast Asia. You had spices grown in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and other parts of Southeast Asia. These were picked up, and what was given to them in exchange? A very interesting trading pattern developed whereby India's textiles were exchanged for spices, and then these were sent to West Europe. So it was an exchange which gave a lot of prosperity to both parts, because the East Asian countries were developing their spices and the other items of trade. India was developing its textile trade, and all parts of India participated in this, and it worked very well indeed. When the colonial powers came, they wanted to share in it. And in fact, Britain, when it came to India almost 100 years after Portugal, they actually first went to Java, to Bantam. They said, let's go there because the spices are there and we will trade there. But when they went there, they found that if they wanted the spices, they had to pay for it in gold. And then they discovered that the Indian practice was to give textiles in exchange for that. And in fact, many contracts were even written in terms of so many bushels of spices, or pepper, or nutmeg, or all the other cloves and so on, and such value of clothes from this part of India, this will come from that part of India, etc. So that is why Britain came to India, to take control of this trade. And they found, of course, that Indian ships built of teak wood were very, very valuable, far larger, far long-lasting, 60, 70 years each teak wood ship would last. The British oak ships would last much smaller. So they used the Indian teak wood ships, and also sponsored, in fact, supported the shipbuilding industry. But after Britain got political power in India, after 1857, and the trading, the EIC stopped, and you had British colonial direct rule in India, Britain took immediate steps to shut down the shipbuilding industry. So much so that they, in fact, India even forgot that we were ever a naval power, that we ever built ships. And they started taking control of the weaving industry, because they started exploiting the weavers. And because of the weaving industry, the farmers losing their wealth, they went into penury. They even could not grow, and famine started coming to India. So we can see how by Britain destroying the shipbuilding industry, taking control of the textile weaving industry with very, very adverse terms of trade for the weavers, who were actually also the farmers, and then with the poor distribution of food in terms of difficult times of year, we had a huge amount of famine. So in fact, Britain is what led to the impoverishment of the Indian economy. And from what I told you, 33% share in world GDP in 1 AD, it was even 24% or 25% in 1500 AD, it was 25% even in 1700 AD, but then it fell. It fell at time of independence to just over 4%. And Britain's share, which was less than 1% in world GDP, went up to 10%. So you can imagine the adverse terms of trade. The third thing that Britain did, which was, I think, by far the most difficult, that it wiped out the memory of the trading relationship between India and Southeast Asia. So whereas the Indian traders who were in interaction with the sultans, with the Hindu Buddhist kingdoms in Southeast Asia, and the sultans of Malaysia and Indonesia, now the British trader took its place, and there was absolutely no mention of this interaction between India and Malaysia in the pre-colonial times. So you did see that at 1947, it was a very difficult situation where India had lost her entire trading power, and also had completely wiped out the memory of her shipping industry, the memory of the interaction with Southeast Asia, and it became a very difficult situation. But we still believed in Asian relations. And you will see that in 1947, when in 1947, Prime Minister, the first future Prime Minister of India, Nehru, organized the Asian Relations Conference, because the memory of the leaders was still there. And he said, we must have Asian Relations Conference. We must develop this relationship. That was a very, very successful meeting, a very prescient meeting, a great visionary meeting. But it was never followed up, because after Asia, China, which was present, of course, at the Asian Relations Conference, was supposed to hold the next one, and China did not want to. They did not want to develop relations with Asia on the terms that India saw it as a very equitable relationship, and so it was something that did not develop at all like that. And we had at that time, immediately after that, in 1955, instead of continuing with the Asian relations concept, we had in Bandung the Asian African Conference. And this Asian African Conference led straight into the non-aligned movement, because you saw that after that, between Prime Minister Nehru and Joseph Broz Tito of Yugoslavia and Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt, the non-aligned movement came about. And this had its own geopolitical significance for the years of the Cold War, because by this time the Cold War had already started. But I must tell you that the countries of Southeast Asia kept up their memory of their closeness, their friendship, their interaction. First, the ASA was formed, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which had just 3 countries, which had, Malaysia and Thailand and Philippines. And then after that, ASEAN was formed in 1967. ASEAN was formed in 1967. India was invited to be a member, because I can tell you that although it was wiped out of the history books, the memory among the leaders, among the ancient texts was very much there. But India at that time declined to join ASEAN, because it was the years of the Cold War. There was SEATO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, which was very much a Cold War organization. Pakistan was also a member there. So there were several reasons why India then decided not to join ASEAN, but continued strongly with the non-aligned movement and continued to develop our bilateral relations with each of the individual members of ASEAN, and develop them to the best of our ability. But then we come to 1991, which was a turning point for India, because at this time we saw in 1991 3 crucial events take place. First of all, the breakup of the former Soviet Union. So India's huge trading partner, India's huge area of development of trade and economic cooperation just broke up overnight, and it was a very, very difficult situation. So it also meant the end of the Cold War. We also see at this time that India's economic situation was dire indeed, because after being 4% of world GDP at time of independence, India's share fell further. And in 1973, we were just 3% of world GDP. So you can imagine the dire economic situation. And in 1991, we actually were in such dire situation that even the gold had to be placed to get money to run the economy. So Prime Minister Narasimha Rao took very bold decisions. And at that time, in the 1990s, the ASEAN tigers were roaring. Their economies were growing, they were very prosperous. So it is Prime Minister Narasimha Rao who brought in this look east policy. And he decided to develop the relationship with ASEAN. And it's amazing to see that this relationship with ASEAN, which was developed started in 1992, because in 1992, just 1 year after this, in discussion with all our countries, we started a sectoral dialogue partnership with ASEAN, and it worked very well. These were limited to some sectors, and we worked very well. But then very quickly after that, in 1996, we had a full dialogue partnership. So after this, in the full dialogue partnership, the foreign ministers' relationship with ASEAN developed very well. And it was a very positive engagement with ASEAN. And then in 2002, which was the 10th anniversary, we decided to have the summit, the India-ASEAN summits relationship. And we had this summit upgraded to the summit level in 2002. And all this time, while we were developing these relationships of the summit level and the other level, India and ASEAN were working very, very steadily to develop, to integrate India's activities with a number of ASEAN ongoing activities, including the foreign ministers meeting, including now the annual summits, and on the sectors, working on trade, working on cooperation, working on a free trade agreement, and working on a agreement in goods and services. And all this worked very well. Now, it was on the silver jubilee of the India-ASEAN partnership. 1992 we started. It was on the silver jubilee 18, which was in the which was there, which we developed, decided on the silver jubilee of the relationship to focus on the maritime domain. We realized that once again, after a millennia and more had passed, we needed to develop this maritime partnership, and this is what was lacking in the relationship between India and ASEAN. So the focus comes first in the India-ASEAN Silver Jubilee celebrations, that we will focus in January 2018. We decided that to focus on the maritime domain, and after this we have recently, in June 2022, the 30th anniversary of India-ASEAN relationship, and we had a commemorative foreign ministers meeting in Delhi in June, just 2 months ago. And this was the document of that meeting, shows in a very, very clear-cut way what is the areas in which the India-ASEAN partnership has developed, where it is going, and where we would like it to be. So let us see where it is on the 30th anniversary. The trade relationship between ASEAN and India has grown enormously, and from a trade which was maybe $5 billion in 1996, it is now crossed $100 billion. So you do see that this trade in services, trade has grown hugely. This is just the trade in goods, and the trade in services even more. And you have among the countries of ASEAN, three or four very important partnerships for India. One is Singapore, there is Vietnam, there is Thailand, and there is Malaysia and Indonesia. So these 5 countries of ASEAN have a very, very strong trade relationship with India. Of course, from Malaysia and Indonesia, palm oil is a very, very big factor. But with Vietnam also, we have a very robust relationship. While this relationship was being developed, we do see that a lot of the security aspects of the maritime domain came into the relationship. We had the ASEAN-India Defense Ministers meeting, the ADMM++, where India is a part of the security dialogue between ASEAN and the East Asia. We are part of the East Asia Summit, where the ASEAN members plus Japan, China, South Korea, then Australia, USA, Russia, and India have the East Asia Summit. Another very, very important aspect of the partnership. And these aspects were very important because it showed how we are building on the building blocks of the India-ASEAN partnership are encompassing almost every aspect. When I said that India and ASEAN had forgotten about their pre-colonial interaction, it was Rabindranath Tagore who actually brought back the memory of this interaction when he went to Netherlands, and he was told, because while the British colonial areas in Southeast Asia, principally Malaysia, Singapore, and so on, they did not allow excavation even to keep the old relationship hidden. The Dutch, who were the colonial powers in Indonesia, allowed that. And a lot of the information came up. Rabindranath Tagore brought back the information to India. And there was a big debate in India at that time, whether India at any time had any kind of a colonial relationship with Southeast Asia. And this was completely incorrect. India's relationship with Southeast Asia was never colonial. There was no hub and spoke relationship. There were 2 completely independent, autonomous areas working on the basis of trust and mutual benefit, and in areas which were of shared interest and benefit to both sides. Now, I think this aspect of the relationship, again, is being replicated today, because we are working on the areas which fit into the ASEAN factors of their Treaty of Amity and Cooperation. The ASEAN has its own areas of cooperation in the Indo-Pacific, what they focus on. India has given its own suggestions to the East Asia Summit on the Indo-Pacific initiatives that should be there. And India and ASEAN are working together on all these, on the issues which bring us together, on issues where there is a common denominator, and carrying those issues forward. So what are these areas that we are working on between India and ASEAN? We have seen that these areas are education, culture, cooperation. In the maritime domain, there are a huge lot of areas. In fact, the economy, the security, the free lanes of communication, the fact of having a code of conduct to prevent, misuse and to prevent any curbs on the freedom of navigation in this area. And to do all this, India has created 3 funds through which we support the ASEAN cooperation. One is the ASEAN India Cooperation Fund, the ASEAN India Green Fund for the ecology, and the ASEAN India Science and Technology Fund. In fact, India has offered 1,000 scholarships for ASEAN students to come and study PhD level in the Indian Institutes of Technology and other IITs and others. So, it shows that we are looking at all times at the areas of interest to ASEAN and carrying forward the relationship in that. India today has a separate ambassador to ASEAN, also based in Jakarta, and working with the ASEAN Secretariat in Jakarta. In fact, India and ASEAN have set up a project management unit so that which monitors all these projects. Are they being implemented on time? Are there any delays? What are the problems? How do we overcome these difficulties? And these are the areas in which India and ASEAN is working very carefully. So today, in the context of the Indo-Pacific, which has now taken up very well and gone ahead, there's been an Indo-Pacific Quad Summit held in Tokyo in the month of May this year. The India-ASEAN partnership acquires a tremendous significance. I'd like to point to one very significant strategic fact in this partnership, which is that whereas in the first 1500 years of this of the Common Era, India was at the center of the trade relationship between Southeast Asia and Europe. Today, it is ASEAN which is at the center. And ASEAN centrality is a key factor in the strategic partnership between India and Southeast Asia. India welcomes this, India supports it, and India makes sure that the ASEAN centrality, which means following what the ASEAN priorities are, making sure that they are together and they are working together, and India is taking on this partnership based on the areas in which they have interest. So the commitment which we had is now transformed into a strategic partnership between India and ASEAN. This was at the also at the 20th anniversary of India-ASEAN partnership. And now in June of this year, we have agreed to go even further ahead and develop a comprehensive strategic partnership. So this shows that we are building up this relationship very strongly. Mutual benefit is the cornerstone of this partnership. As it was earlier, so it is now. And both India and ASEAN are committed to further deepening and strengthening this partnership. We uphold all shared values of the UN documents, of the ASEAN values, and the agreed documents between us. During the COVID-19 pandemic, the cooperation between India and ASEAN on COVID-19, on vaccines, was another new area which came in. Another important area is on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief. Beginning with the tsunami of 2004, India and ASEAN have developed strongly this area of partnership. And both India and ASEAN are committed to evolving a rules-based regional architecture, which will make sure that the role of ASEAN, the role of India, the role of all countries will be on a rules-based global structure, taking into account the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea and other UN conventions which are there. And the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, as mentioned by Dr. Adityanjee earlier, is a very significant outcome of the Quad. It's the first significant outcome in the Quad. We know that 7 members of ASEAN have joined the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, and the areas that the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework is looking at have a lot to do with of the maritime domain, maritime security, and this critical area of IUU fishing, which is illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. This is a very important area because all the ASEAN countries are depend on maritime trade, on fishing for their domestic trade, for their domestic consumption, and so on. And we want to support them. We also, all the countries in this region suffer a lot from illegal trade, and so we want to build up these linkages in this area. And I must say that the when the first recognition or recall by Rabindranath Tagore of the India-ASEAN partnership, there was a lot of doubt among the ASEAN countries at that time. Should we talk about the civilizational aspects or not? But today, it is ASEAN itself which is very importantly talking about the civilizational linkages between India and ASEAN. I can tell you my own experience. In 2016, I was chairing a committee set up by the ICCR, Indian Council for Cultural Relations, on soft power projection. How effective is India's soft power projection? I visited all the countries of South Asia, Southeast Asia, and many others to look at it. And I was quite amazed to see that in countries like Indonesia, in countries like Thailand, they were telling me, at the academic level, in universities, among the civil society, that we want our people to recall their pre-colonial, their their civilizational partnership with India, because this is what will ground us for the future. If we forget our history, we will have nothing to hold on to for making our children, believe in the value of ASEAN, believe in the value of their own individual identities. Bangkok said, you must send us Sanskrit teachers. We want to teach Sanskrit. We want people to remember our prehistoric past. In Indonesia, at a very senior level in the Ministry of Culture, the Director General level told me that, look, we want our country to remember our pre-Islamic past, because that is a very important factor which weakens the forces of radicalization, which weakens the forces of fundamentalism. So these countries themselves have recalled and remembered and brought in the area of civilizational, and there have been two ASEAN India conferences on civilizational links, which have brought out a lot, and these are continuing. These conferences are continuing. And at the last summit meeting, India-ASEAN summit meeting, the East Asia Summit, which took place in October 2021, you can imagine how the areas of India-ASEAN and East Asia Summit ASEAN cooperations have gone. We have even looked at documents on mental health, cooperating in the area of mental health, because the stress that people suffered during COVID, during the pandemic, being the lockdown and so on, has created these kind of new areas. Then how shall we do economic recovery through tourism and sustainable development? And so these are some of the new areas. In fact, through my own group, South Asia Women's Network, I'm also developing a lot of cooperation with ASEAN in the area of Nari Shakti, as Dr. Adityanjee said, in the area of women's cooperation, because in both India and ASEAN, in South Asia and Southeast Asia, the women play a very significant role in the economy. But I think in ASEAN, there is greater recognition of that role. In India, still, in South Asia, still, there is not so much of a recognition or a value given to the role which these countries play. So when we look at the future of the India-ASEAN partnership, the future strategic factors that have to come in, as we move from a strategic India moves from a strategic partnership with ASEAN to a comprehensive strategic partnership in ASEAN, we have to remember that there is an elephant in the room, and that is China. And I think that it is important to look at that, because both India and ASEAN are suffering the same aspects of the cooperation with China in different ways, in very different ways. Between ASEAN and China, there is a huge issue of the code of conduct for the South China Sea. And we all know that China has given this 9-dashed line on its maps, which gives them, in their own view, gives them territorial responsibility or territorial rights over a large part of the South China Sea. Now, that is a matter of grave concern, not only for the ASEAN countries, but also for countries like India and USA, who are committed to sea lanes of communication being free and open, committed to maritime navigation in line with the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, and will not accept that one country can try and control the maritime navigation in an area where a major part of world trade passes through this area. We also know that under the international tribunals and international arbitration tribunals, this 9-dash line has been declared untenable. But China refuses to accept that. Now, ASEAN and China are trying to negotiate a code of conduct for the South China Sea, but it has been dragged out and dragged out for decades. It is nowhere near completion. Even in June, 2 months ago, the Chinese foreign minister was at the foreign ministers meeting in East Asia foreign ministers meeting in Cambodia. Cambodia is the present chair, soon to end their term. And oh yes, we're going to do it very quickly, etc. But there is no movement at all. There are territorial disputes, maritime territorial disputes between Malaysia and China, Philippines and China, and Brunei and so on. And these are nowhere near settlement. So these are, but ASEAN has its own way of operation. They operate very quietly. They feel very uncomfortable in a position of having to choose between China and USA or China and India. So we are continuing this dialogue and cooperation with ASEAN in our own way. We are also developing the strength of the partnership with ASEAN in so many areas that we all the time recognizing that we attach the highest importance to ASEAN centrality and ASEAN unity. Now, I'm a little worried about this factor of ASEAN unity because we do see that in recent years, months, I would say, that there's a pressure on ASEAN unity as well. The events in Myanmar that took place have brought about a lot of pressure on this concept of ASEAN unity because ASEAN did take its own way to find a solution to the situation in Myanmar. They appointed their special envoy. In fact, the Cambodian foreign minister is the special envoy of ASEAN for Myanmar. But really speaking, it has not worked, and ASEAN has not been, and Myanmar has not been even participating directly in many of the ASEAN meetings, which is a great pity because it is the first time, in all these decades of ASEAN that this has happened and this impingement comes. Now, Cambodia also, there was a lot of pressure from China on Cambodia. And I remember in 2012, the first time, at that time when Cambodia was the chair of ASEAN, they couldn't even have a foreign minister's statement issued because, because Cambodia was not willing to move the text in a way which would annoy China in any way. But in this 2022 meeting in Cambodia at the foreign minister's level, it worked well. There was a good statement and it is working well. And I've seen obviously that in the Indo-Pacific economic framework, only 7 members of ASEAN are there. So obviously these matters are there, and we would like India on our part, we would like the ASEAN unity and ASEAN centrality to remain as a very, very important part of the ASEAN strength, and we would like to support this in every way possible. And I think that the coming of Quad, the coming of this plurilateral platform that addresses contemporary challenges and opportunities in the Indo-Pacific in a very, very direct, but a very significant way, because we are looking at maintaining supply chains. We are looking at maintaining the freedom of the seas so that trade is not affected, and we can maintain the supply chains for all the participants in this trade, which affects USA, which affects India, which affects all the ASEAN countries, and the Indo-Pacific from the eastern shores of Africa to the western shores of the USA. This huge area where you can see on the map clearly that ASEAN is the center of this area, and we would like that strength to remain. So I think that the main challenge is to maintain the ASEAN centrality and unity, and to work together in specific areas of maritime concern to make sure that the maritime security is maintained and the maritime freedom of navigation is maintained, and how with this the prosperity of trade can continue to grow. Because in the post-COVID phase, it is this revival of the economies that is vital. It is this revival of economic strength and dimension that is absolutely vital for us, and I feel that we have to, through Quad, through the Indo-ASEAN framework, through the East Asia Summit framework, we have to use all these different platforms on micro and macro level to bring in the clear understanding and realization that no one country can try to be a hegemon in this area. And no one country can try to prevent another country's trade development, trade growth, development of bilateral relations with any country, development of multilateral relations with ASEAN. So this has become an important dimension. Maybe I've spoken for about 40 minutes. I could stop at this point and say that at all times we want the relationship between India and ASEAN to be meaningful, substantive, and mutually beneficial. I'll be very happy to answer questions.
Thank you very much indeed, Ambassador Veena Sikri, for such an exquisite, detailed, scholarly lecture, starting from history to challenges of colonialism, current phase, and future prospects. It was an intellectual feast to listen to you with such a depth and breadth of knowledge that you imparted upon us today. I see there are a number of questions in our chat function, and I will go through them one by one. But before I take the chat functions, using my role as the moderator for this session, I'll make a few comments, and they are essentially, reinforce what are the things you have said. So going back historically, India has never been a colonizer, and it was portrayed that India was a colonizer there. India had a trade relations, but India also had cultural relations. Whole of the Southeast Asia, or what we call ASEAN today, used to be called Indochina at one point in time during the colonial times. If you realize that languages of some of these countries are heavily influenced by Sanskrit. So whether you have Bahasa Indonesia or Bahasa Malayu or Thai language, all of them have predominantly Sanskrit words, and that is the India's cultural influence. In fact, there are countries that have names that are Sanskrit based. So the island of Borneo has a country named Brunei. And actually, both the word Borneo and Brunei are the derivatives of Sanskrit word Varunaha. Varunaha became Varuno or Baruno. So colonialists called it Borneo. But these are Sanskrit based words. The titles of the kings, they are Sanskrit based titles. And in fact, the current dynasty, ruling dynasty in Thailand, Princess Mahachakri, is a great Sanskrit scholar participating in international Sanskrit conferences. So whole of this area was not India's colony, but India's cultural influence was very much there before the colonial times and before the Islamic times. There are countries that cherish their pre-Islamic history. Indonesia is one of them. But there are countries that do not cherish that pre-Islamic history. Malaysia is the prime example of that. They would like to wipe out any pre-Islamic Indian influence in that country. So we have to be, aware of that, because that creates not only bilateral problems, and it has created bilateral problems, but also in the multilateral framework or Indo-ASEAN framework, Malaysia has worked as an irritant because of their reluctance to acknowledge their pre-Islamic past. We talked about, the Indian Navy's influence. If you look at the Chola Empire, King Rajendra Chola and Raj Chola, their navies were profound, and they went up to Philippines, and they had trade and they had cultural and educational linkages with whole of the Southeast Asia. So when Arab traders converted the rulers into Islam, India's influence started to wane, and Western Europeans, Dutch, Portuguese, British started to exercise their colonial reign. Of course, all India's influence was sort of undone in a way. You have a country like Singapore, which is Sanskrit-based name. It is Singhapura. So we had a lot of, history over there. Looking back to, post-independence India, amongst the number of foreign policy mistakes that were made, one of the Himalayan blunders was India's rejection of founding membership of ASEAN by Prime Minister Gandhi. It was a Himalayan mistake under an arrogance that we are part of non-aligned movement, we don't believe in security pacts, security conglomerations, and ASEAN was certainly not designed to replace CATO, which the regime at that point in time conceptualized. So this was a major mistake that we are trying to undo at every summit level because we don't have the space on the table. If we were the founding member of ASEAN, we would have so much of outreach in geopolitics, in Indo-Pacific and things like that. So that is second comment I would like to make. Although some of the ASEAN countries have good relations bilaterally with India, the problem I won't consider Myanmar. I would more consider problem as Cambodia. The strong man of Cambodia, Hun Sen, who has been ruling for last 40 years, is basically a Chinese proxy in the ASEAN. And dysfunctionality of ASEAN as a grouping is brought to fore, and you had mentioned about that they could not bring out a statement. As far as Myanmar is concerned, they have their own domestic politics issue, and they are under influence of China, but they are balancing China quite a lot. So what you can say about Hun Sen, you cannot say about the military junta in Myanmar. So the stumbling blocks for ASEAN's dysfunctionality are basically Cambodia, and I would say to some extent vis-a-vis relationship with India, it is Malaysia, which creates problems and tempers down the enthusiasm of other countries for bilateral, increasing the bilateral influence with India. So these are some of the things I wanted to bring to forth in front of our audience, but we are ready for questions, and I know there's a string of questions, so I will read the questions one by one. First question is by Mr. Vijay Nilikeni, and he says, although there's a goodwill for India in ASEAN, India is overshadowed by China's influence in ASEAN. How does India overcome this unhealthy Chinese leverage?
Okay. Well, I think the Chinese, what the word used, overshadowed, I think that shadow is dissipating very fast. There are two reasons for this. First of all, if we just take the recent decades, this whole BRI concept, the Belt and Road Initiative of China, I think that has really backfired. Because after the example of what happened in Sri Lanka with Hambantota port and the debt overhang putting the economy into such dire straits, we have seen that it's come as a big shock for many countries who were earlier very active and willing participants of the Belt and Road Initiative. So this concept of China not being a philanthropic partner, rather being the opposite of a philanthropic, a misanthropic partner, that is now coming up a lot. But of course, China's aggression, I mean, even their wolf warrior diplomacy. I mean, one doesn't use aggression necessarily in the terms of physical aggression, but I'm talking of their wolf warrior diplomacy, has also created pressures on ASEAN. But at the same time, it's also put off ASEAN because wolf warrior diplomacy is not the ASEAN way at all. Their ASEAN way is very gentle, it's very kind, it's very quiet. You work out a lot of things behind the scenes, and you only come into the conference when everything has been worked out, and you have very gentle speeches and so on and so forth. So the ASEAN way is very different. So I think And this is the second reason why the China presence has been watered down. Third, of course, is the South China Sea. That China has been so rigid on the disputes, the maritime disputes, the presence of islands, Spratly Islands, Paracel Islands, all of that. Vietnam is there, Malaysia, and so on. It's very disconcerting, you know, for the ASEAN countries. I mean, it's remarkable, for example, how Malaysia and Thailand have solved their dispute over, the Gulf of Thailand and the ownership of the resources, and they share the, oil and gas resources of that region. It's a remarkable example, and I always use that for. It should be used even in South Asia, but it doesn't work with China, you know. So this is where the China's very strong methodologies, but as having said that, the Chinese trade, the Chinese presence in terms of trade and their exports to ASEAN is so huge that it's going to take some time. But then that trade has not been accompanied so much by investment, whereas the methodology that India and ASEAN want to go through is this mutually beneficial economic cooperation, investment, and even educational investment. As I told you, even the students coming to do PhD, getting information technology, IT training, and then going back and having their own companies, Indian companies investing in ASEAN countries and vice versa. So this aspect is something that suits the ASEAN way of working, the ASEAN way of life, and it has grown by leaps and bounds. But there's great potential yet to be done. I mean, 100 billion in trade is really nowhere near the potential. I mean, it could really grow much further. And, this ASEAN trade in services should also develop much more. There's been problems in that. And, India is not a member of RCEP also because of this problem that, the third country origin goods, and we have a real problem with that, with those goods coming into India and so on. So these problems are there, but they're being solved and ironed out very easily. I think that one of the important aspects we need to continue to focus on is people to people, because this is India's strength. And anybody who comes to India, whether to study or as a tourist or on a school tour or an educational tour, goes back with a totally strong impression of what India is all about India's democracy, India's openness, India's willingness to share its wealth of knowledge with all other countries. So we are very conscious of China's overwhelming presence in ASEAN, and I think that this has been a very important factor in our developing this people-to-people relationship. But it is changing. I would not be worried about it right now. I think China's internal economic problems are big enough. They are worried about that at the moment.
Thank you, Ambassador Sikri. If I may add, you mentioned China's BRI initiative and realization now that BRI is actually economic colonization. Besides BRI, China has created an institution or a special purpose vehicle called AIIB, Asian Infrastructure Bank, in which China has put billions of dollars, and that's a way of controlling the economy of ASEAN countries. So we may have to think in terms of creating something analogous to that to undo the Chinese influence. Going back to wolf warrior diplomacy, that term has come out in the last couple of years. But I recall that 8, 9 years ago, I think in Singapore or in Jakarta, in one of the, whether it was Shangri-La Dialogue or one of the East Asian Summit, then China's foreign minister and state counselor, Jiang Yiqi, did mention that China is a powerful country. And there are large countries and there are small countries, and ASEAN countries should realize that distinction, that China is a huge country and you have to listen to us. So all this hysteria about wolf warrior diplomacy, which is recent, was actually being manifested in China-ASEAN relationship for a long period of time, and that's why code of conduct would not be agreed to, because China would want actually to dictate terms and also interfere in the functioning of ASEAN using Cambodia and sometimes Myanmar and sometimes Laos. So those were the factors over there. I think about Mr. Vijay Nilikani's question, how we can, reverse this kind of influence. We have to set the narrative. Those who set the narrative eventually control the discourse. And just like the narrative has been changed from Asia Pacific to Indo Pacific, I would suggest that all international relations scholars don't use the word South China Sea. We can use the word West Philippine Sea, North Natuna Sea that Indonesia is preferring, or South Champa Sea, which Vietnam is using. So I think we have to be aware of these nuances. By continuing to call it South China Sea, we are giving right to China to say South China Seas are domestic lake, which it is not. These are international waters. And I think sometimes you have to change the narrative to influence the behaviors. And I think that is what needs to be done. I am going to go to the next question, which is from Mr. Ripudaman Pachori. And he has asked, please shed some more light on the current and future prospects of defense partnership with ASEAN countries.
Yeah, I think the defense partnership is a very significant development that has taken place because while the ADMM format which the ASEAN has developed is a very good one because security interests are common. While individual countries may have specific aspects of defense cooperation, like with Malaysia, for example, we have a lot of defense cooperation in the aviation sector. Even servicing some of their aircrafts or training some of their people or even on joint development and so on. With Philippines, India has sold BrahMos missiles to Philippines. So that is the thing. So we have with individual countries our own bilateral relationship. But in the ADMM format, we look at shared security concerns and where India and ASEAN and can work together to meet these security concerns. And obviously, again, maritime security is a key factor. And I think that it's very important to get this collective view because then the ASEAN also gets a sense of the support that they are receiving from other countries for their views on the code of conduct in that area. I won't use South China Sea in that maritime area, but I think that this is important. And specific issues are discussed, specific papers are prepared, documents are discussed. There's an agenda, and areas which you may not want to talk about openly in an open conference, but which are significant. Even this issue of the IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing is very important. It has a defense implication because the maritime the maritime food chain is vital for every country. It's vital for the food security. It's vital for the waters, for replenishing the waters. It's vital to tackle the plastic debris and so on. But you can't have these ships coming in from China and catching as much as they can, processing them, putting them into the freezers, and then taking them back. So it's had a huge impact, and it has security implications because how does a small country tackle those big vessels? How does a small country tackle those big vessels unless you can exchange information about the trawlers and the other ships which are there on the seas at any one time from a certain country, and you can get the identity of those vessels and know that these have come in peace and friendship, and there are other vessels which are coming unregistered from on various different flags. There's a lot of technical area study that can be go. Then even your land boundaries, some cases like of course Myanmar and India is one example of that, but maritime boundaries between all the countries. How do you increase your maritime cooperation, joint research for resources of the sea and so on? So there's a great deal. We attach a lot of importance to the ADMM format and the defense minister cooperation format that is taking place.
So before I go to the next question, I'll add a couple of things about the security challenges. And Ambassador Sikri, you very rightly told about this Chinese poaching, illegal, unreported poaching of maritime food resources from the littoral countries. If I remember, if anyone else remembers, in 2009, by a presidential decree, Hu Jintao declared that all the China's merchant marine vessels will become dual-use vehicles. Now that is very ominous. So these are not fishing trawlers. These are extensions of PLA Navy, because they have been altered and they are very ready to fight a naval war against anyone that challenges them. And it is not a recent phenomenon. That decree was given by Hu Jintao in 2009. So it is really a serious problem. I think India has onus to improve the relationship in the strategic sense, not only bilaterally with each country, ASEAN country, but with ASEAN countries as a grouping. And I think time for that will come. So you talked about, in Sri Lanka, what China did with Hambantota, but they are also developing a port at Sittwe in Myanmar, which is going to be Chinese naval base. China has a listening post in Coco Islands that was gifted to Myanmar by Jawaharlal Nehru. So there are a lot of security dimensions that we need to look into. And although we are going to have a integrated theater command in Andaman, I think we need to develop some recuperation and refueling facilities in pretty much all of the Southeast Asian countries to deal with the challenge. I'm going to move on to the next question, and that is from Mr. Satya Doshapati, who is based in New Jersey. He's thanking you for your wonderful talk, but the question is very specific. After Malaysia gave refuse to Zakir Naik, Malaysia-Bharat trade relations were strained. What are such flashpoints, and how can both sides respect each other and cultural concerns while moving towards increasing mutual prosperity?
Yeah, the difficulties with Malaysia are very real, and the refuge that has been given by the Malaysian government to Zakir Naik is certainly a big flashpoint, because I mean, the kind of speeches that Zakir Naik has been making before and after are certainly not conducive to peace and harmony and stability in countries which believe in pluralistic societies and believe in freedom of worship and so on. I think that this is reflected very closely with Malaysia's own internal politics as well. And this is the difficulty, that how does one get Malaysia to make sure that the internal politics reflect the value systems that they themselves talk about in international fora, and the UN value system, their own constitution, which gives freedom of worship, non-discriminatory freedom of worship, but actually in the very real sense, it is a totally different picture on the ground. And we have tried to talk to Malaysia about this by maintaining a very active, friendly relationship with Malaysia, by maintaining a dialogue with all their leaders, which come at all stages. And even now, we hope that in the ASEAN context, Malaysia will go along with all the other countries, because this is a matter of worry even for Singapore. Even Indonesia does not believe in this kind of, radicalized form of Islam that Malaysia is supporting. And so, of course, even in Thailand, so all these countries, they have a different. We know that even over the Myanmar issue, over the Rohingya issue, over the state of Rakhine, ASEAN is divided on this issue of religion. So it's a matter on which one has to tread very carefully, and which one can do a dialogue individually with all countries. But also, I think it is important to show to countries like Malaysia that this kind of propaganda, anti-Indian propaganda, that in India it's like this, and the Muslims are being treated in this way, that's not true. That you come here and see it, and I think this is a very important factor. So this people-to-people dimension, getting people to come here, live here, study here, and see what is happening. And this interaction is important to overcome this, so that the people themselves will understand that the situation is different. Otherwise, this reflects very creates a very difficult situation for the people of Indian origin in Malaysia, as we know, that this has made their situation very, very fragile indeed. And we have, this is one area on which we've been working for since 1957, since Malaysia got independence. And we would like to continue work on it. I think the West themselves, it's not that they are playing politically, but frankly, I must say that the countries of the West have not yet come to an appreciation about how to tackle the problem of radicalization. How to tackle the problem of fundamentalism in Islam is something the West has not yet come to deal with as yet. You know, you string from one, okay, we'll talk to them, okay, we won't talk to them, we'll sanction them, we won't sanction them. It is a very mixed bag of messages that come out from different countries. It's a very sensitive issue which India attaches the highest importance to. We are always talking among ourselves how it should be dealt with and so on. So I'm glad you raised it. It deserves care and attention.
Before I read the next question, I am going to join a little bit, and I agree with you 200% that the problems that are reflected in India-Malaysia bilateral relationship and trade relationship are an epiphenomenon of Malaysia's domestic politics. And if I can go historically, following the 1979 Islamic revolution in Iran, there was a wave of fundamentalism gripping Malaysia, especially Malaysia's ruling political establishment party called UMNO, United Malay National Organization. And from time when women will dress in modern European dresses to starting to use initially hijab and then full-scale burqa, that was culturally very alien to Malaysian society and Southeast Asian society we saw under our own eyes. But there was a phase of 22 years when a particular person, Mahathir Mohamad, was the prime minister. That is when the India-Malaysia relationship nosedived. And there's a reason for it. Mahathir Mohamad is a third generation descendant of Malayali Muslim immigrants to state of Kedah in Malaysia. And since Malaysian domestic politics is governed by Bhumiputra policies, in order to burnish his Bhumiputra credentials, he took a stringent anti-Indian viewpoint in domestic politics and started to cultivate Pakistan and rejected India's relationship overtures with the country because he wanted to portray to his domestic audience that he's a real Bhumiputra. He was more royal than the royal themselves. That did play a role. And this Zakir Naik incident again happened during second tenure of Mahathir for a period of 2.5 years. When age of 92, he became prime minister again. So you see that it is reflection of domestic political bias because there was a time Malaysia was very, very inimical to India's interest, whether it was in 1965 war with Pakistan or when the subcontinent became nuclearized. Malaysia had a very stringent anti-Indian response. So from point of view of bilateral as well as multilateral relationship with ASEAN, India will have to keep a watchful eye on Malaysia. These problems are not going to disappear immediately. There's a question from Mr. Nilikeni, and I think we have already talked about it, but I think we have some time, couple of minutes, so we can discuss that. And this is, Myanmar seems to be a problem child and troublemaker in ASEAN. It can create trouble for ASEAN and India. What are your viewpoints, Ambassador Sikri?
Yeah, the Myanmar issue is a very sensitive one, and I think that it's very difficult to see how you can. I think ASEAN is the only organization that can put pressure on Myanmar for them to go back on the path of democratic development. Now, India's relations with Myanmar are complicated by the fact that we have this huge land border, and of course maritime border as well, but we have a huge land border with ASEAN, with Myanmar, and that across this border is Northeast India, in the states of Northeast India, and many of them have a ethnic relationship, family relationship with the people of, like the Chins of Myanmar. They are the Mizos of India, and so there is already a lot of coming and going between them. There's a facility that they can go and cross the border and so on. In fact, right now, a lot of people from Myanmar come to the northeastern states for education and for medical treatment. Because west of the Irrawaddy River in Myanmar, the development is very little. In fact, there's always been comparatively little attention being given to developments on the west of the Irrawaddy River. And you know that in places like Mandalay, China's presence has gone up hugely. In fact, they bought up properties and so on. So it's a very, very sensitive relationship because of the presence of insurgent groups. Now, insurgent groups, of course, we know that in Myanmar, there are these ethnic armies there, but India also, there are a number of northeast insurgent groups who are being given shelter by China, but because of the Chinese presence in this part of Myanmar, and because of the relationship between the Chinese army and the Myanmar army. So it's a very complex situation. At the same time, India has developed a good relationship with the Myanmar army, and we need that for tackling cross-border insurgencies along the land border. So on a day-to-day basis, when something happens, there's an incident, there's a firing, some Indian officers are killed or border security guards are killed, or across some insurgent group, people come across into India and then go back. We have to deal with the army outposts on the Myanmar side and talk to them on a day-to-day basis. Otherwise, it becomes impossible, So that is why India has continued its dialogue with the Myanmar government. And ASEAN at the same time is doing its best to bring the Myanmar government back to accept development and to accept elections, for example. And to hold them as quickly as possible. Now, at the moment, they're saying they will hold it in 2023, but I don't know. And we know that Aung San Suu Kyi is now likely to be under arrest for several years, 6 years or more. So, her presence in what will happen to the NLD, we don't know. It's a very complex situation, but ASEAN is the only one that can place pressure on Myanmar, because I must say that China, the Myanmar army, you can say maybe close to China, but they are very wary of China as well. And I can tell you that across Bangladesh, you have a situation where, China, some of these armies in the Arakan, China supports, has good relation with the Myanmar army and also supports the ethnic armies. So they're doing both. They give, weaponry, defense aid, this, that to both sides. It's a very difficult situation. And the Myanmar army is balancing this as well, facing the pressure, but I hope very much that they agree to come back to the democratic path of elections. And the internal strife that is there in Myanmar today is very damaging. It's very damaging for Myanmar. It's very damaging for the development of the country, for the future of the country, for the prosperity. I mean, they have sunk into poverty from a level that they were coming out of poverty. They were coming out of it, So
thank you,
something that
Professor,
a lot of attention. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Ambassador Sikri, for this, trying to tease out the enigma called Myanmar and its relationship with ASEAN or India on the other hand. Just to reinforce what you said, I would give my personal opinion. India must continue to engage with Myanmar, whoever is in power. That is very, very important for India-Myanmar bilateral relationship, as well as our influence in ASEAN. India should not make a fetish of democracy in Myanmar, because Myanmar's society has its own challenges. The army, one does not support it, one does not support atrocities against civilians, but looking at Myanmar's army's perspective, on one hand, they are wary of China. On the other hand, they were very wary of Western imperialism, because they considered NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi as a proxy of British imperialism because she was resident in England. Her two children are born in England, are British citizens. Her late husband was a British citizen. So she was initially felt as a British plant in Myanmar to control that country again by the imperialist nation. I think that is very, very important to understand from Myanmar's perspective. Now, the second time after doing the elections and co-opting her into the power structure, why the army struck back again? That is where the China factors comes. Myanmar is very, very wary of China, Communist Party of China, and Xi Jinping for that matter. And what had happened that Xi Jinping had invited Aung San Suu Kyi to China for a bilateral meeting. And apparently there was some budding chemistry going on. And in order to prevent China from acquiring Myanmar through Aung San Suu Kyi, they struck this route. We have had good relationship with the military regime as well as the previous democratic government. So we should not make democracy as a fetish. I may remind that the first Indian surgical strike was in Myanmar against the Naga rebels with possible concurrence of Myanmar authorities. So, they have been able to accommodate us, and we should not actually, just on the basis of US pressure or UK pressure or Western European pressure or making a fetish out of democracy, we should not be trying to antagonize whoever is ruling that country. Remember, Thailand has had multiple military coups. We are engaging with them, China is engaging with them, West is engaging with China. Even the current government of Thailand is basically a military government by any different name. So we have to have real politics here and continue to guard India's interests. I think that is where we have all the time. We are not going to take any more questions. Again, I'm deeply, deeply thankful, grateful for this exquisite lecture, things that people just gloss over because they do not understand the nuances. Having worked in Southeast Asia, having worked in Malaysia, you bring actual knowledge and scholarship to this discussion. So this is your first appearance on our platform, but this will not be, I can assure you, the last appearance on our platform. On behalf of the Council for Strategic Affairs and on behalf of our audience, I am highly thankful to you. I'm also thankful to our audience members. On a Saturday morning in US, they are kind of, taken time off 1.5 hours of Saturday morning to listen to this lecture. So I'm very thankful to you. And I'm also thankful to Team CSA, mainly Mr. Pachori as well as Ankush Bhandari, who are the people working in the background, helping me arrange these sessions. So we shall be meeting again, I think, on Saturday, September 10th, and we will be talking about terrorism because September 10th is just one day before September 11th. So we'll be talking about challenges of terrorism, and we will have a roundtable discussion. And I hope all our audience will participate in that. Our notices and announcement will go forward. And with those comments, we will formally end this meeting and saying my namaskar to Ambassador Veena Sikri. Namaskar.
Thank you. Thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed talking to all of you. Okay, bye.
Bye-bye.